So moving from one of the newer members of the family to our next speaker, who probably needs no introduction. Prof Bas Bloem is known, I think, to most people in the room. You can go through his bio yourselves. Just the last line, Bas, the Tom Isaacs Award. Great, fantastic. Along with all these fantastic achievements that you've amassed along the way. Bas is a consultant neurologist, as you know, but I think whatever your clinical background or research background, you kind of feel you interact with a bit of him because he's quite a polymath, a great champion of the multidisciplinary team. Look forward to Double Dutch, Bas.
Thank you so much for the invitation to BL, of course, to the Parkinson's Academy. I really look forward to a long-lasting partnership. My team has visited the Parkinson's Academy, has been impressed with your educational offerings. I think I'm here as much to learn as I am here to bring. Tonight is all about cases. I have about material for about 3 hours. I'm not sure who was planning on turning in early. I can stop in 10 minutes, I can stop in literally 3 hours. We'll see how far we get, all right? It's just my passion for patients. And I'll start with one, maybe one of you, two of you have seen it, but this is one of my favorite patients. And he's the concertmaster of the Netherlands Philharmonic Orchestra. And he developed Parkinson's. He'd seen 2 consultant neurologists prior to seeing me. And what the 2 prior consultants had done is up his medication until his tapping test was perfect. But of course, his passion was to play the violin. And when he came to me as a 3rd doctor, I said, well, why don't you bring your violin so I can see what's your problem? And let's hear, his violin play. Well, you don't have to be an expert violinist to hear that he starts off tremendously well, and then it goes from bad to worse, which is the hallmark of Parkinson's. This is what bradykinesia is all about. So you all recognized Bach's Violin Sonata number 1 in G minor, Presto, and we had another elite violinist score the notes, and you can see there's an error in the beginning, a second error, and then increasingly many errors until he stops, completely frustrated. And when we had my PhD student, Rui Arajo, quantitatively listen to this, you can actually hear the decrement. So this is a quantitative signal of Parkinson's. And you know that looking at these clinical scores, which range from 0 to 4, is just a horrible clinical scale. We just had a paper accepted in movement disorders to demonstrate that the UPDRS is a horrible scale of tracking individual disease progression. It's like saying in the middle of Rome that the Pope doesn't exist. I'm so happy it got into the Movement Disorders Journal. So let's listen to this. You can hear his tremor. Can you hear it? So when we quantitatively analyze this, there's a perfect 6 Hz resting tremor. You can argue whether this is a postural tremor or a resting tremor. I actually think it's a resting tremor in this state. So we now have a whole trajectory, and I know Alan Moon is in the audience. I know he has a passion for using these images or sounds to quantitatively analyze Parkinson's. I think this is an example of how the naked clinical eye often fails us, and how just listening or objectively observing your patients can help you to get a quantitative signal. So we published this in the Annals of Neurology, one of our lead journals, under the provocative title, Listen to Your Patient. I actually like the title. It's a modern time and era where we need to listen to our patients, and in this case, literally listen to his violin play. The story gets even better because I got invited about a little over a year ago to lecture at the Edinburgh Culture Festival, which you're probably better aware of this than I am, is the largest cultural festival in the world. And my task was to tell the ministers of culture of all around the world that saving on art is harming the population's health. So that's a big task. And then I decided to invite Julian Herben, my patient, to do the presentation together with me. And these are images of our joint presentation. We upped his levodopa, because what you heard is tremor and bradykinesia, which are dopa-responsive signs. So we upped his levodopa a bit. A occupational therapist provided him with a wrist splint because his right wrist was sliding off the violin. So with a multidisciplinary team approach, we prepped him for this public appearance, which was his first appearance since he resigned from the Netherlands Philharmonic Orchestra. And I'll show you the footage of his appearance, which gives you the goosebumps, I promise.
Give the technicians 2 CDs that I recorded before Parkinson started, and I will be playing with the other guy. So if I miss something, he won't.
Isn't that brilliant? A duet with himself, with his former self. Then he received a standing ovation from all these ministers across the globe, which I think is just incredibly wonderful. And we all talk about personalized medicine. You talked about why opicapone works for some and not for others. And we all think about pharmacogenetics, profiling your DNA and trying to customize your medication to your DNA profile. But this is, to my mind, personalized medicine, just listening to the wishes and deep desires of your patient and trying to customize your multidisciplinary approach so that he can do what he loves to do. And in this case, be an ambassador for Parkinson's more than anything else. So we published, actually, I got an invitation by the BMJ to outline my talk, which was published in the Christmas issue, to my great pride. It's my second time I published in the BMJ's Christmas issue under the title Art for Better Health and Well-Being. And the interesting thing is, I'm fascinated by dopamine. You all should be fascinated by dopamine, because if you have lack of dopamine, you develop Parkinson's disease. If there is enough dopamine, you become creative and you become an artist. And without going into the full details in the interest of time, but that paper very nicely outlines how some patients, when you treat them with dopaminergic medication, become artists for the first time in their life, which comes very close to addiction, which of course is in the same spectrum of dopaminergic stimulation. Whereas, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, people become apathetic, depressed without dopamine. So it's a really fascinating, it's a wonderful paper to read. It's arguably the nicest one I think I wrote. So going further into some cases, Parkinson's has long been regarded as a motor disease. And for many reasons, I regard myself as a motor guy, as you can see very nicely in this little cartoon. My PhD was on postural reflexes in Parkinson's. This is an old little booklet. This is my original PhD thesis. It's one of the few copies left. And it was really on the motor contribution to balance disturbances and falls. But there's a lot more to Parkinson's, and I'll highlight one patient which I felt was really... I think this is common and under-recognized. We're doing the whole ParC Dix maneuver.
Ja, je ziet hem.
And you see this rotatory nystagmus.
En nu dooft hij uit.
Which nicely shows extinction after a few seconds. This is classic position-dependent benign vertigo. Now, what I found, I saw a number of these patients in my clinic who came to me and said, my balance isn't right. What is your first intuition? Is it must be your Parkinson's, it must be your impaired balance. So we did a formal study that we published in Parkinsonism and Related Disorders, which I think is a really relevant study. We asked 305 consecutive patients in a community-based hospital, not your typical university-based patients. We asked them about complaints of dizziness, did a Dix-Hallpike in all of them, and also tested for orthostatic hypotension. The interesting thing is, about half of them said they were dizzy. So I predict that most of you, when your patient tells you, I'm dizzy, you think orthostatic hypotension, which is common. And yes, of course, 38% indeed, upon testing, had orthostatic hypotension. 8% had BPPD, benign position-dependent vertigo, which had never been diagnosed. And another 4% had atypical complaints, which could still fit a possible diagnosis of BPPD. And then when we did a canalith repositioning maneuver, the Dix-Hallpike, 63% were symptom-free. So people who came to us with a complaint of postural instability, which we automatically ascribed to Parkinson's, and we tried to increase levodopa, was in fact BPPD, which is a treatable condition. So I thought it all started with an NS1 observation. And I think, and hopefully some of you recognize this, you know that after surgery, patients are more prone to develop BPPD because their head moves less. And if you've got Parkinson's and your head is always in this still position, maybe you're just more prone to develop BPPD. And certainly it goes under-recognized and it's treatable. So BPPD is common but under-recognized and it's treatable. So I thought that was a worth message sharing. So back to motor, I'm still a motor guy, to motor freezing. This is one of my latest patients who friended me on Facebook. I try to be a modern doctor, so many of my patients actually reach out to me through Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And this is Nikolaos Koukoulakis. I'm sure you've all heard of him. He's the former European champion in weightlifting. And just look at his biceps here. Quite impressive. He developed Parkinson's, and he shared this video with me on via YouTube, which I think is impressive. So this is typical freezing in the home environment. We'll come to that in a minute. Crammed environment, this is ideal for producing freezing of gait. But he can climb stairs without any effort, which is a different motor program. He can ride a bicycle. You know, my little claim to fame is we published this man who could ride a bicycle but unable to walk. The moment he climbs off his bicycle, he's stuck. But the real reason for sharing this video is he's still an avid exerciser. And even though he can barely move, he can now, after exercise, move normally. And look at the ending of the video, which is brilliant. Huh? So exercise is a new symptomatic treatment for Parkinson's. There is now class 2 evidence that exercise works as a drug for people with Parkinson's, for the motor symptoms, probably for the non-motor symptoms. We just submitted a big revision to the Lancet Neurology. I think it'll go in to show that exercising on a stationary bicycle at home 3 times a week gives you as much symptomatic benefit as one of the add-on drugs in Parkinson's. So a stationary bicycle is as good as opicapone, and you need both. You don't need one or the other, you need both. Isn't that interesting? So, few things about freezing of gait. Many people think, lay people, but some physicians think that freezing is being completely frozen to the ground. That's not freezing. Freezing is actually very mobile. And people tend to compensate. This is beautiful. Look at this. Isn't that nice? And people develop this. Shall I just play it again? It's just so nice. This is him in his naturalistic behavior, getting stuck with turning. Whoops! I think it's brilliant. And this is another simple solution. This is a video by Evgen Rudzika, my friend from the Czech Republic. Typical freezing with a lot of trembling. So it's a very, freezing is a very dynamic feature. He has this jerry can with gasoline that he kicks around. And he can skate as a compensatory movement. The one slide that I forgot to put in, but the paper that's I think is really is worth reading is one of our latest papers in JAMA Neurology, where one of my PhD students reviewed all these hundreds of tricks developed by patients, and we discovered 5 main categories, each with about 20 to 30 variants. It's in JAMA Neurology. It's a really beautiful paper. And I think it's nice because a physiotherapist typically has their favorite compensatory strategy. It's auditory cueing, beep, 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 or it's visual cueing, going over stripes. But how many physiotherapists go through the whole battery of compensatory strategies with each patient? Because some like auditory cueing, others like visual cueing, some like to skate, others like to cross their legs, some like to walk like this. It's all individualized. Again, personalized medicine, but now for rehabilitation. It's a paper in JAMA Neurology. Another little thing that I wanted to share is a very recent paper we did, again with Evgen Rudzika from Prague, is on fascination. And we realized there is 2 types of fascination. We rarely see fascination these days, but there's 2 types of fascination, which we propose in this little paper. And I'll show you the 2 variants. One, I'll show it first, and then you'll see the video. One type of fascination is the small shuffling gait, small steps, combined with a balance problem. So people are falling forward, but their steps are too small to catch up with their balance. You understand what I'm saying? So this is 1949, prior to levodopa. That's important. This is typical fascination. Did you see it? The second type is something, and I'll come to that in a minute, is something that only became apparent after the introduction of levodopa, which is freezing of gait. So this man's got fascination, but this is more of the freezing type. You see the progressive smaller steps? And it's because his feet get stuck to the floor. And this is his compensatory strategy, which is purposely taking bigger steps. So he puts his mind to taking purposely big steps as a treatment for fascination. So again, something useful for physiotherapists to use. We now know that freezing affects all body parts. This is freezing in hand movements, which is one additional reason why the tapping test is such a cumbersome test in clinical trials. This is freezing of hand movements, which is actually not uncommon, and it hampers the interpretation of your tapping test. Again, I'm looking at Alan, who had the GDNF trial with a negative outcome, perhaps because the clinical trial outcome, the UPDRS, is not the perfect measure to what is really happening in the brain. You know, there's many companies out there with disease-modifying treatments who put all their eggs in one basket, which is called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale. And I think the scale is just a very difficult scale. And for example, freezing of hand movements hampers the interpretation of the test. And obviously she's got freezing of gait as well, but freezing of hand movements also exists. This is freezing of speech. It's in Dutch, but listen.
Het is helemaal niet goed. Het is graag vandaag namelijk. Heeft hij er 1 verloren of hebben ze gewonnen?
I won't play the full, it's in Dutch, but this is freezing of speech. What I find really interesting, and I've been very inspired by Meg Morris in Australia, that all the treatments we tend to use for freezing of gait, for example, visual cueing or auditory cueing, can be used as much for freezing of speech or freezing of swallowing as they can be used for freezing of gait. So in the next video, this same man who's got bad freezing of speech uses a metronome. He paces himself for speech.
Heb je dat ook? Ik praat nu met de metronoom. Weet jij wat de volleybaluitslagen van deze week zijn? Ik heb nog niets ontvangen.
Isn't that interesting? So, freezing of speech is susceptible to auditory cueing or visual cueing, as is freezing of gait. So I think this is a very nice illustration. My talk tomorrow morning is about non-pharmacological interventions, but this is a prelude to my talk tomorrow morning. And then there is such a thing as freezing of swallowing. It's also a little story about publishing papers. We thought this was a provocative finding. It was freezing of swallowing, which was actually not uncommon, and it had a devastating consequence on the patients affected because they lost weight tremendously. Freezing of swallowing has a poor prognosis. So we sent it to the New England Journal of Medicine, who reviewed it and then just rejected it. And then we went down the hill. You recognize the feeling, and we ended up not to disembarrass movement disorders clinical practice, but isn't that interesting? You barely make it to the top, and then you end up here. But anyways, so this is the video, and look at the soft palate here. So this is a barography, I think that's the proper word in English. And the typical freezing frequency is 3 to 8 hertz. And there, did you see it, the soft palate? Freezing of swallowing. And these are typically people with their mouth full of food who can't swallow, or if they swallow, they develop aspiration pneumonia, which is one of the 2 big killers in Parkinson's disease, along with hip fractures. Again, look at the soft palate there. Do you see it? So, and we quantitatively analyze this, and it's the exact same frequency that we know from freezing of gait. It's the same thing. Now, what is really fascinating is André Barbeau, Canadian neurologist, who died very young, unfortunately, wrote in this paper, 1971, 4 years after Kotsias introduced levodopa, that he was beginning to see a new type of Parkinson's. This paper, The Lancet, I think has been neglected for a long time. Barbeau said, I'm beginning to see something different. And what he probably meant was freezing of gait. So, little sidestep, this is my mother. I will explain why I'm showing you my mother. My mother had multiple sclerosis. The one reason I went into neurology was to hopefully cure my mom, which actually never happened, of course, because she had MS. And at one point, I decided to go to the United States to boost my career, and my boss said, what a coincidence. This week, Bill Langston happens to be in Leiden. He'll take on students. I said, oh, is he an MS guy? He said, no, he's a Parkinson guy. I said, that's no good. But he works in California. I said, all right, I'll do the job. So he wanted to do long loop reflexes in MPTP-induced Parkinsonism. And I had no idea about long loop reflexes. This is it's involved in balance. That's why I got my PhD on this. This is all coincidence. I had no idea what MPTP was. But my boss said, he works in California. And I said, all right. Somebody needs to do the dirty job, and I will go to California and crack the nut. So this is one of my oldest papers with Bill on the MPTP model as a young medical student. And I had the fortune of running into Bill again just recently at one of the Movement Disorder Society conferences. And Bill is actually, he's sharp as a razor blade still. He's, I think, in his late 70s, early 80s. Wonderful, wonderful man. And I said, Bill, did you ever videotape your MPTP patients? And he did. So he had 8mm films stowed away in his attic somewhere, which had never been published. Because nowadays, as you know, I always jokingly say, when patients come to the Radboud University Hospital, we shake hands with the right hand, and we start filming with the left hand. Immediately. That's why I've got so many films. Bill had actually videotaped the patients, never done anything with it. So we ended up publishing this in the Lancet Neurology, came out last year, and I'll share you the videos because it gave us two very important observations that go back to André Barbeau's original observation. So this is the very first patient that Bill encountered. This is George Carrillo. And this is a young Jim Tedroot that you can see there. And you can see he's very slow, he's bradykinetic, he's rigid, but there's no tremor and there is no freezing of gait.
Touch you right here.
Can you see there's no tremor, no freezing. There's an extremely slow, that's why initially these patients were felt to be catatonic. They were initially sent to psychiatrists because they thought they were catatonic. And this is Bill. This is the second patient.
Let's try it. Stand.
Again, very, very slow, rigid, no tremor, and there is no freezing of gait. He's very, very slow, but there is no freezing. Bill is actually a fascinating guy because once they started to treat him with levodopa, he became very mobile again, went back to his, you know, these were drug addicts, went back to his old habit of robbing houses, but now he developed freezing of gait. So on the way out, carrying the loot, he froze on the way out, and the police said this was our easiest catch ever. But only after levodopa. And this is him with levodopa in the early days. So levodopa on the one hand helps to overcome bradykinesia, but the MPTP patients were the first hint that maybe levodopa plays a role in causing the problem, which André Barbeau was suspecting in 1971. The other interesting thing that we mentioned in our Lancet Neurology paper is the extreme difference in phenotype.
Here on our patient.
So this is Toby, huge tremor. So isn't that interesting? These are all men, same age, same batch of tainted heroin, same cause, two completely different phenotypes. One is completely akinetic, rigid, no tremor, the other one has a tremor. And that part has been neglected in the original papers by Bill Langston and Jim Tedroot when they published it. And this is just to demonstrate that they also developed a whole battery of abnormal involuntary movements, but already within weeks to months of treatment. So I use this story to all my patients to warn them against levodopa or medication phobia in general. These patients, to my mind, are the most persuasive argument that dyskinesias in advanced Parkinson's are caused by the severity of the disease and not by the drugs. These severely affected MPTP patients developed a whole battery of involuntary movements within weeks. And we now know that patients who stay away from drugs because they're afraid of levodopa or any other treatment for months and years, and once they finally take their medication, within a short time they become severely dyskinetic. So it's the disease that's mainly responsible and not the drugs. So I use that story to my patients a lot. So then we published this new paper that came out in this year, again in the Lancet Neurology, where Peter Keuler, who is a wonderful neurologist but also a historian, where we went back to old videos of Parkinson patients. And we went to the textbooks to see if André Barbeau's suspicion was right. And I'll just share you some videos. So I think this is the oldest film of a patient with Parkinson's. This is Arthur van Gehuchten, who was a Flemish neurologist who fled Belgium just prior to World War I. And he was the first one to use footage to film his patients. And you can see the tremor, the stooped posture, the slow hyperkinetic shuffling gait. But there is no freezing. There is just no freezing. This is another patient. It's the typical Parkinsonian gait, but there's no freezing. And when we looked at all the videos that Peter had on record, when we reviewed all the textbooks, prior to levodopa, there was no freezing. And just to show that Parkinson's is more common in men, it's accelerating faster in men than women. We can talk about that later, maybe over a drink. But it also occurs in women, and it's the same thing. It's a slow, shuffling, hyperkinetic gait, no freezing. So we think that levodopa plays a role in causing the problem. At the same time, this is a man, a modern patient with pink Parkinsonism, bad freezing of gait, the typical, the hyperkinetic movements, the dynamic nature of freezing. But with a hint of levodopa, he's much, much better. Now, the autosomal recessive forms of genetic Parkinson's tend to be exquisitely dopa responsive. So this is not to say that all freezing is so dopa responsive, but it just shows that there's this double-edged sword. On the one hand, levodopa causes the problem. At the other end, once you have it, you need more levodopa to treat it. That is true for the majority of your patients, except for a few. This man is now in a profound off state. He's been off his levodopa for more than 12 hours. This is like the MPTP patients or the old historical patients. Slow shuffling gait, tremor, but no freezing. Until we treat him with a high dose of levodopa, now he's dyskinetic, and now he's got freezing. So this is on-state freezing. But this is rare. So we published this in Neurology, and we worked with 4 university-based centers across the world to find 4 patients fulfilling these criteria. So most freezing, that's my main take-home message, is dopa responsive. The pulsatile treatment is probably the reason why people develop it in the first place, but once they have it, you need the same dopaminergic treatment to treat it. Some of your patients actually have levodopa-induced freezing of gait. The 2 tricks that I use is I ask my patients, how do you walk at night? Nocturia, as you know, is very common. If people tell me they walk better at night, and if they walk better in the early morning prior to the intake of their first dose, they might be your patients who are suffering from dopa-induced or on-state freezing of gait. So my private hypothesis is that there is a certain threshold to treat your appendicular symptoms. We all tend to tweak our pills until this test is fine. I'm sure you recognize this. There's a certain threshold. So my hypothesis is that the threshold for freezing is here. So if you're below the threshold to treat your arms, you've got off-state freezing. But I think the threshold to treat gait is higher than the threshold to treat your arms. So patients who are satisfactorily treated for their arms may still be in a bad state here. So if you are pushing your levodopa and you still have freezing here, this is what I would call on-state freezing. I think most patients that you see in your daily practice have good hand movements, but still bad freezing. But this is not real on-state freezing, it's pseudo on-state. And you still need to push your medication to treat it. For the large majority of patients, This phenomenon is rare. This is, I think, is very common. So hopefully you can take that to your advantage. We're close to finishing part A of my presentation. You think I'm joking, I'm not. Most of you have probably heard of my Gunslingers Gate paper. This is my other British Medical Journal Christmas issue paper on Gunslingers Gate, and it's the paper where we showed, I'm not going to show the videos again because I've showed it at the ABN and the Academy before, but I'm going to show you another video which I think is interesting. So we showed that Putin is consistently not swinging his right arm, nor is Medvedev, nor were 3 other top-notch Russian officials. And you can think, is this an epidemic of right-sided Parkinsons in the Kremlin? No, we discovered it is KGB gait, because they've been trained to keep their hand right close to the holster, ready to draw the gun when confronted with a foe. So it's a behavioral thing. So we published this in the BMJ. It exploded in the media worldwide. We've been interviewed on, literally everywhere, except in Russia, actually. It's a little sidekick to the story. It's been literally all over the world, every newspaper, every news station. 3 weeks later, I received an invitation from Moscow to give a lecture on Parkinson's, and I declined. I thought, I'm not going to go. And you would read in a newspaper that sadly the taxi with Professor Bloem skid off the bridge and now he's dead. Or they found 30 kilograms of cocaine in my, I'm never going to go to Russia. That's my fate. So we found this on YouTube, the Russian officials. And I just found a new one, which I think is just glorious to share. It's the Crown Prince of Morocco. The dude is 14. Look, he's not swinging his right. He's a swagger. He wants to look just like Putin. Isn't that incredible? It's a sign of power, I think. Not swinging your right arm is just a sign of power. Isn't that interesting? He's 14. And look how they all love him. Isn't that fascinating? 14 years old, already doing it. Anyways, so we can stop here or go to part B. What do you think? Yeah, B? Okay. We've got John on the line, fortunately, who's been with the Academy for 14 years. Yeah. Can we give John a little applause because he... The thing is, John, many people complain bitterly when things go wrong. When things go well, they think it's normal, but it isn't. So that's why you deserve the applause. People like you are really worth their weight in gold. So part B, it's just a little sidekick. There's a lot of interest now in the relationship between freezing, which is one of my hobbies, and anxiety. So anxiety plays a sort of again, it's a double-edged sword. If people come to your clinic, gait is always normal, much to the frustration of the spouse, because they freeze at home all the time, and they come to your clinic, and the partner says, "Come on, Fred, freeze," and they won't. Conversely, when they're at home and they walk, and suddenly the doorbell rings, that's when they freeze. So it's a double-edged sword. So anxiety is a big thing now in the world of freezing, and I've got one video to illustrate that very nicely to you. Talking about a nice gait. It's, That's freezing. I think that's freezing. The interesting thing is, why do people develop freezing? This is almost philosophical, but I think some freezing is actually beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint of view. For example, to prevent yourself from falling off a cliff or from approaching a predator. So freezing may have some advantages, and maybe this is just a release of a primitive, inherent protective mechanism. This is still debated. So a little bit on compensation, which is one of my main hobbies. I love to learn from my patients. Siebold Hulsberg is one of my patients who made this beautiful painting, blue and gold, but actually it's a brain, but embedded within it is, here is a mouth, exactly where Broca's area is. And there's a little ballet dancer where there's the frontal lobe. And the whole brain is explained by all these gyri and sulci. And he's got a YouTube video explaining the making of and the interpretation of the painting. He's one of my Parkinson patients. Isn't that beautiful? This is perhaps my favorite patient. Her shirt says, "I'm not as innocent as I look." It's not Parkinson's, but she's got myoclonic ataxia. And we published several papers on her. She's got a ribosomal DNA mutation. It's a very rare, it's Baltic myoclonus. She's got myoclonic ataxia. And she's got this bad action myoclonus. She's severely debilitated. She just turned 40. The oldest patient was 27, so she's beating all the odds. But what is so wonderful is that she uses her shocks to make paintings. So she just like Van Gogh was using, it's called pointillism in art. She uses her shocks to make this painting, which is obviously now in my office because it gives me the goosebumps every time I talk about it and I show this. Isn't that beautiful how she uses or abuses her disease to take it to her advantage? Another beautiful video, and John, we need the sound here, is we have a studio in the Radboud University Medical Center, and we broadcast live television to our Dutch patients once every month. We've done 65 episodes. This would be wonderful to collaborate with Peter and Sarah. We've done 65 episodes in the Netherlands. We've got about 10,000 viewers in Holland. We've done 10 episodes in English, which we recorded in New York. We have up to a million viewers in the United States, which is incredible. It's a talk show setting where we talk about issues that matter to patients. In this case, it's about food. We had one about travel, about sex, about sleep, about real wonderful issues. The reason for mentioning this is not Parkinson TV per se. By the way, it's all on YouTube. It's downloadable for free. It's all accessible to your patients as well. So if you just do Parkinson TV on YouTube, it's all there. But one of the patients, so there's always a patient at the table. This is one of the patients. Another patient, in between the episodes, gave me this wonderful story. Just listen to his story.
Okay, Richard, you told me a compelling story about how you first noticed that you had Parkinson's disease.
Well, I didn't know necessarily that I had Parkinson's disease, but I had a symptom that I knew something was going on. And the symptom was I was doing some house painting.
Yeah.
And I noticed that I could not paint straight lines with my right hand any longer.
Yeah.
And so I was switching to my left hand and starting to learn how to paint with my left hand while I was undiagnosed or not yet diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Once I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and I was receiving proper medication, I now can paint with either hand and I can go twice as fast. So that's one of the benefits, perhaps, of Parkinson's, if there is such a thing as a benefit.
Isn't that beautiful? Paint with either hand and be twice as fast. Beautiful.
Oh.
We've seen this guy. So this is another interesting one. This is freezing, swallowing. So this guy learned to swallow like a duck.
Slikken.
Joep.
Ja, nog eentje?
He was really unable to swallow his medication, but with his behavioral trick, which he calls swallowing like a duck,
Schudden.
Wiggle his
Naar voren kijken.
brain
Slikken.
forward and swallow. Now he can take his medication. So these compensatory tricks extend well beyond just gait. We had compensatory tricks with painting and now swallowing. So this is my all-time favorite slide. This is Parkinson's. The problem is still there. but with a little counterweight, you can make the system function again. And I'll talk about this extensively tomorrow morning early when we talk about rehabilitation strategies. But this is what makes Parkinson's different from MS or stroke or neuromuscular disease. It's a very treatable, and in that regard, for us, a very gratifying condition. It's a horrible disease, but it's a treatable condition, provided you know your stuff. And I think in particular for allied health, and this is why I love to partner with the Parkinson's Academy, allied health specialists need to know all the variants, all the tricks that are out there to optimally treat their patients. So whatever you see in a chronic disease is what the disease is doing to you, plus what your brain and your system is trying to make of it. And we, neurologists, geriatricians, rehab specialists, tend to focus on correcting the dopamine deficit. But I think allied health and others, you need both. It's not one is better than the other, but you need both. And this is one of my big passions and also the thrust of my talk tomorrow morning. This is another little paper I did in Practical Neurology on waiting room signs. So we published this in the Practical Neurology. This is maybe my second best paper. I really enjoyed doing this. So I always enjoy looking at my patients in the waiting room. And for example, you see patients practicing the tests they know they will get. Or they take extra levodopa or opicapone or whatever to look well for their doctor. And of course, you want to see the real problem. So I always peek around the corner to look at the next patient. And we put down all that experience with my teacher. I was trained at the National Hospital by Andrew Lees. Andrew still is my source of inspiration, with Tony Lang, another wonderful clinician. And we published this paper in the Practical Neurology. And this is a video to illustrate the point. Practical Neurology actually invited us to do a little video. So there is buzzers and meters. People are next patient. But always go and meet your patient. So here you can already see, this is the guy, actually the fascinating guy. You may recognize him. I actually recognized this fascination in the waiting room for the first time. See how they sit down. Take a look around. Yeah, there's a resting tremor. You get that for free. It's for free. Here's another resting tremor. See how he rises from the chair. It's slow. His balance is a little bit shifted backward. He's unobserved now. He doesn't really know he's observed. Look at the handshake. Is it a cold hand sign, for example? Grasp reflex. I look at freezing of gait. This is how I collect my patients. I walk backwards. No, this is how I do it. This is not joking. And then see if they freeze in the doorway. So it's really, it's a wonderful little paper full of pearls in clinical practice.
It's going to be a long presidency, and perhaps nothing encapsulated the way many of us feel right now better than
Talking
Japanese
about the
Prime
handshake.
Minister Shinzo Abe. On Friday, he met with our new president for what was a comically long and marathon-like handshake, but just watch his expression at the end. I feel you. I feel you. That is the Prime Minister of a...
So he's got this really strange, maybe, is it a dystonia, maybe? I don't know. But revenge, this is wonderful. So revenge is underway.
Another memorable moment they had. Once again, Mr. Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron engaging in a lengthy handshake. This is the beginning. He pats on the hand.
So
the
Trump,
two leaders
actually, Macron is getting back at him.
Bastille Day parade, talking, looking around, never releasing that we can tell. Looks like they're still together. Still together. Now it's clenched. It's moved to the chest area. It's back and forth. Now, still maintaining the handshake and giving a little kiss. Another handshake now to President Macron's wife.
It's crazy.
At some point, you will see her also still handshaking.
This is two alpha males.
Finally, the release there. But now, the two first ladies begin their own handshake, and that one's rather extended too. You can see
happens in women as well.
They have their nice kiss on the cheek, still holding hands, still. We're going to get little timers with this. You know what we need? Have a telestrator.
Right, so our viewers know a telestrator.
And this is the Polish president also getting, so that people now know that Trump is doing this. Yeah, his wife rubs. Chuck, and look at this. Up. So he now takes the lead, so that's really interesting. The other thing that's in our practical neurology paper is the rocket sign. So you get this patient who's referred to you for Parkinson's, not responding well to medication. You say, Mr. Johnson, and whoop, up he goes and falls down into the chair. Andrew Lees described this as the rocket sign. So people with Parkinson's disease are very cautious in their movements. If people tend to be reckless and very explosive in their movements, for example, the rocket sign, then this could be progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, the rocket sign. All the signs you get for free in the waiting room. And this is, again, to relate to the handshake. This is an image of the cold hand sign. I always use the spouse as my healthy control to check for environmental temperature, but if there's the extremely cold hand, it could be a sign of multiple system atrophy, autonomic dysfunction. And we tend to call these the red flags for Parkinson's disease.
Kunt u even zeggen wie u bent?
Not sure if you can hear this.
Waar u vandaan komt.
Dat is goed. Mijn naam is Annie van Maarten Linders en ik woon in Grubbenvorst. Ik ben 77 jaar. Ja.
En Grubbenvorst ligt?
Grubbenvorst, dat ligt in Noord-Limburg, vlakbij Venlo.
Can you hear it? It's in Dutch. I realize it's in Dutch, but can you hear that she's actually speaking in a voice like this, which is described as a harsh and high-pitched voice? This is typical multiple system atrophy. You know, it's the first pleasantries, and immediately you suspect this is not Parkinson's disease. So the other thing is, we always tell our registrars to undress our patients because of neurophacomatoses and other reasons. But look at this little patient, little history. So this man told me he had a tremor in his feet, but I couldn't see it. So it's actually a video. You think it's a still, but it's a video. But you would agree there's no tremor visible. So when I looked at him again, look at this, at the shoelace. So the shoelace acts as a lever, just like earthquake detectors. And it amplifies the signal. So actually the man was right. Of course the patients are always right. He actually has a tremor. So we published this sort of tongue-in-cheek. And we actually did a tremor analysis. So there's a very nice 4.6 hertz tremor in his shoelace signal. And we published this under the title, The Shaking Shoelace, saying that, yes, we need to undress our patients, but sometimes clothing can give you some very useful information about your patient as well. Are you still fresh and okay? Just 1 or 2 on treatment, is that okay? Or? So this is...
Maar even kijken of u kunt laten zien hoe u loopt.
Put down the signal, John, if you can. So this is, because it's in Dutch, this man's got severe depression, which our psychiatrists call melancholia. Deep, black depression. But look at his gait. If I look at it as a neurologist, I think this is freezing of gait. So he's never had any Parkinsonian signs, goes into this bad depression, which a psychiatrist called melancholia. It was treatment resistant, 2, 3, 4 antidepressants. Then he receives ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and after 2 bouts of treatment, not only is his mood improved, but now his gait is also markedly improved. And there's a few anecdotes, and I think one small uncontrolled study, that ECT can sometimes, in your severely depressed patients, can be a good treatment not only for the non-motor symptoms, but also sometimes for the motor symptoms. This paper is now under review. We submitted this as a case report. And this is another really, really interesting treatment that fascinates me. This is a paper we did in the Lancet Neurology on the gait circuitry. Don't even try to read it in detail, but there is such a thing as a spinal pattern generator in our spinal cord right here. So there is this paper, which I find one of the most provocative findings in my field in the last years, on spinal cord stimulation. So what people now do, and this is Mender Jog in Ontario in Canada, he implants a stimulator at the mid-thoracic level on the spine, to stimulate the dorsal columns as a new treatment for freezing, hoping to boost the spinal pattern generators. So this is their design. What they did is a baseline evaluation, implanted the spinal cord stimulators, optimized the settings for an individual person, toying with the bandwidth and also the frequency of the stimulation, and then have a follow-up medication for patients once it had been optimized and individually tweaked. So that was their design in a paper in the Movement Disorders Journal. And look at the videos. This is the patient while on medication without the stimulation. This is with optimal settings. And this is with the optimal settings but switched off 1 hour prior to testing. So there's a bit of a carryover effect, but not much. And there's a marked improvement, a real marked improvement. And this is the long-term effects. After 6 months of stimulation, this is switched off for 2 days. This is the real effect, a marked improvement, but even there seems to be a carryover effect even when the stimulation has been switched off. Now, there have been concerns because this is supra-threshold stimulation, so patients feel the tingling sensations, and Parkinson's, as Alan would confirm, is a very placebo-sensitive condition. I think the GDNF trial, your work has shown tremendous placebo effects that can happen in people with Parkinson's. So I'm not saying this is a real biological effect, but it's provocative and it's interesting, and it's particularly provocative because I felt that this is just their group effects on activities of balance go up, UPDRS goes down, freezing of gait goes a bit down, and freezing of gait goes down in their patients at the group level. And what I find fascinating is you would think that this is a descending effect. But what they did as part of the study is glucose PETs. And as it turns out, this spinal cord stimulation does a lot of cerebral resetting, sort of molding your adaptive plasticity in the brain. And they think that maybe the thrust of the effect is actually an ascending effect on the brain, resetting your gait pattern at the cerebral level rather than the spinal cord level. Again, the concern being that this could be a placebo effect, but the cerebral effects are very compelling and it needs more work, it needs further study, but I just wanted to share that with you. And this is one of my latest case reports. This man has got sacral nerve stimulation for urinary incontinence. It's a Chinese patient. This is him with medication off, deep brain stimulation on. He's got freezing of gait, slow gait, but this is with the sacral stimulation switched off. Again, it was provided for his bladder problems, obviously not for his gait. Now the stimulation is on and there's a marked improvement. Again, this is supra-threshold stimulation. Could be placebo effect, N is 1, very careful. But I think it's just provocative that these spinal stimulations could perhaps provide a novel treatment for what is otherwise difficult to treat with medication. And this is my final case that I just wanted to share, is on alternative medicine. I think there have been a number of papers that a lot of our patients, maybe because it's such a devastating disease, resort to some form of alternative or complementary medicine. And one of the most inspiring lectures that I ever attended was by a guy in the Netherlands who said, we tend to say there is regular medicine and there is alternative medicine, and these are different worlds. And what he outlined, and I'm actually now a believer, is it's a spectrum. And he said it's all about credibility. Opicapone is a credible drug because it's been tested in animals, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Swimming with whales has extremely low credibility. And we should, as a society, invest our money in credible interventions. But there's the interesting thing, so swimming with whales is highly uncredible. And for example, the levodopa trial as an example, Stanley Fahn's paper in the New England Journal of Medicine has high credibility. Where the main interest should perhaps be is in this intermediate range. I think dance, mindfulness is here. And our patients put a lot of trust in these interventions. And obviously, I don't want to spend money on this or on this one. This is a paper in the BMJ on remote retroactive intercessory prayer, which was found to be positive. I don't want to spend any further public money on this type of intervention. But in the intermediate part, I think there is value. So this is all about credibility. Is the theory right? The type of intervention, the outcome measure, the culture, and any prior research. And look at the spectrum. So, and one intervention that I find particularly compelling is stress. Stress is it's a big and underestimated item in Parkinson's. Our latest Parkinson TV episode was on stress. It's common in Parkinson patients because of lack of dopamine. And once you have it, it worsens freezing, it worsens dyskinesias, it worsens tremor. So one intervention that I find is in this spectrum of credibility is mindfulness. I'm not here to say that mindfulness is the intervention. I think it's an interesting intervention and it's worthy of further study. And just a tribute to my old friend Tom Isaacs. You mentioned the Tom Isaacs Award. I can say this without tears because I know Tom will be smiling up there somewhere. Tom was just a wonderful advocate, young onset Parkinson patient, started the Cure Parkinson's Trust. And Tom shared this video with me. He had young onset PD, terrible dyskinesias. And by just so I think these are, we call these involuntary movements that are beyond will, right? This is chorea. But with utter concentration and relaxation, he manages to completely suppress his dyskinesias. Again, this is an N-1 observation. It's not the penultimate evidence, but it's inspiring. And it's a tribute, if anything, to Tom and his heritage, his legacy to the world of Parkinson's. But I think this, to my mind, means that we should study mindfulness as a treatment for our patients in a proper randomized clinical trial, as we would study GDNF or opicapone or whatever. So finally, this must be a big thing also in the UK. Many of my patients, how many of you have patients who ask you about Mycuna pruriens? Quite a number. So this is Mycuna, which is an Ayurvedic bean containing levodopa. And I love this one. There's even extra forte, the real deal Mycuna pruriens. And many of my patients, why do I think this is important? I see debilitated patients, bad Parkinsons, who only take Mycuna because they are afraid of regular Parkinson medication. And they think this is a homeopathic treatment so they can stay away from regular drugs. Whereas in effect, it contains levodopa. It's the same levodopa that's contained within Sinemet or Madopar. And at the same time, it's a stupid treatment because we provide levodopa with a decarboxylase inhibitor, right? To prevent the peripheral metabolization conversion to dopamine so that more levodopa enters the brain so that all of your levodopa is converted to dopamine in the brain instead of in your body. So Mycuna is problematic for, it's potentially promising, but it's problematic because you don't add carbidopa or benserazide, and you don't know the dose well. So I had one of my patients, and I said, and she insisted on staying on Mycuna. And I said, why don't you stay on Mycuna, but what if we added carbidopa? Just a little bit of carbidopa. So this is she. This is her without the treatment. And you can see why my hands were itching, this is a Dutch expression, your hand, to treat her. And this is her finger tapping after carbidopa. Just mucuna with carbidopa. And she literally said, I am 200% better. This is her without carbidopa on mucuna monotherapy. You see the nice asymmetry of Parkinson's, and now toe tapping. It's much, much improved. So now I have a number of my patients who insist on staying on mucuna, where I just add carbidopa, which is very cheap. And finally, gait. I want to go to until the end of the video because it's such a nice ending. So it's published in Journal of Parkinson's Disease. And now she went back to John Travolta dancing. So thanks to carbidopa. Isn't that beautiful? So, pre-final slide, you can observe a lot just by watching Yogi Berra, the greatest American philosopher ever. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry? And I'll be in the bar after.
Yeah, so this is where the plenary sessions finish. We go into small groups in the bar, which for further education. Hope you enjoyed the evening. Big thanks to our speakers earlier on, and also Bas for that fantastic, my goodness, how do you describe it? Nuggets of wisdom, science and art. It was all there, wasn't it? Just a couple of boring housekeeping points. Bar is open, not so boring. In the morning, we kick off at 9 o'clock, which I know for many of you is quite a late start, bit of a lie-in, so that's fantastic. If you're staying at the Holiday Inn, suggest you check out and bring your baggage round before we start. Big concierge luggage room downstairs where you can store it. They're very happy to do that. But other than that, we're back on bums on seats, 9 o'clock in the morning. Bas again. So have a good evening. See you in the morning. Good night.